Hey, today I want to talk about creativity, connections, and creativity. Because the quote I've got in my head is from Steve Jobs. I'm not a huge fan of Apple, not a huge fan of Steve Jobs, but there's one phrase on creativity which I really, really like. Steve Jobs once said that creativity is just connecting things. If you want to think about creativity in wider terms, then it really is just that. But the creative process is very much about you find a starting point and then you find something else to attach to it. If you're producing a piece of music, for example, you start off with a little motif, a little idea, a phrase, and then you think about what goes with that. I mean, you might not explicitly be thinking, what component do I stick on that idea? But that is effectively what's happening. You take a little idea, what's the chord that fits with that? Then what's a chord that fits with that previous chord? What's the right extension of that phrase to continue? When you're writing, it's the same. You start off with an idea, and then you start thinking about, well, what do I need to explore that idea? What are my sources? If you're writing in more of a flow sense, you still, whether you're thinking about it explicitly or not, are looking for the next thing to add on to what you've already written. It has to somehow connect in some way. So yeah, when you think about it, it really is just that. Creativity is just a process of connecting things. I'm writing a piece at the moment, writing an article at the moment, and that is effectively how it grew. It started off with an idea. The idea got pitched to an editor. The editor eventually got back to me, asked what sources I would use. So I think of the sources, and then grow that into a wider idea, and now I'm writing it. And it struck me that is very much a process for any piece of writing, and even wider. If I think back to like times where I've painted, you start up with an idea, and then you experiment with things. You try joining different ideas together, see if it works, and if it doesn't, you go for something else. There's a trial and error process, but it's still this idea of you take one concept, stick it on another concept, and then see how it is. I feel that sometimes the element of the creative process which is emphasized is that trial and error section. But if you're not trying to join bits and pieces together, what trial and error process is there? It seems to be the process of connecting things is much more intrinsic than the trial and error idea. It's trial and error is more a name given to a certain approach to connecting things, one that accepts and rejects different connections. So I guess taking into what I've just said, and then thinking back to Steve Jobs' quote, if I were being a little bit more critical about that, this idea that creativity is just connecting things, but then we've just said there's also this element of trial and error. Maybe it's naive to say it's just connecting things, that is the be-all and end-all of creativity. But then I think back to the book which I mentioned in my last video, this Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, and this idea of splitting all kinds of knowledge into effectively immediate knowledge and a knowledge of underlying processes, this kind of academic dialectical way of thinking. In the book, the idea of immediate knowledge, the writer kind of associates that with creativity, immediate response to surroundings as being creativity. Why shouldn't we consider that way of looking at the world as underlying processes as not being creative? It strikes me as being quite odd. Like I said in the last video, that process of putting everything into these processes, applying like analytical boxes on everything. Everything is abstracted. We're very, very happy to acknowledge that when someone paints something, they're creating an abstraction of whatever they're painting. If you paint a tree, you haven't created a tree, you've created an image of a tree, an abstraction of a tree. But then when it comes to some kind of logical knowledge where you've taken each thing that you're interested in and designated in some way, and then making it interact with other things that you've designated some kind of characteristic to, that isn't creative? If you were to think about that scientific process in the terms that Steve Jobs has used, creativity is just connecting things, then that's exactly what a logical process does. Once you've defined whatever your units are, you make them interact in different ways. If you were to put certain elements into a particular process, how do they interact? That is a connection. Yeah, I don't know. Is everything a creative process? Is there anything that we can consider not to be creative? And then when someone says something like, oh, I'm not a creative person, what do they mean by that? And I've got a number of friends who I consider to be very, very creative, but they themselves don't see that. That makes me wonder if there's a certain social element to when we consider something to be creative or not. Like, it's not that something is explicitly creative or not, but we're only willing to consider something creative if other people would consider it creative. So, for example, if you were to draw a chart, it's still a drawing. There's still certain elements of it that required some kind of creative thought and some kind of aesthetic thought, but you wouldn't put it up in an art gallery, would you? Whereas, you can flip that round too. There are so many things that you might find in a modern art gallery that a big chunk of the world's population wouldn't see any creative value in it at all. So when that comes to an individual deciding whether or not they are creative, is that more something to do with social expectations rather than whether they actually are creative or not? Yeah, if we go back to if creativity is just connecting things, then maybe they just haven't made that connection yet. Oh, I don't know.